The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, an ocean of ancient trees and thick foliage that swallowed the sky. The air was dense, heavy with moisture and the earthy scent of decaying leaves. Each step the man took crunched beneath him, though the sound seemed lost to the vastness of this wild place. His heartbeat thundered in his chest as his hand clutched the worn leather strap of his backpack, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him with each passing moment. Nolan had no idea how he'd ended up here, some strange rupture in reality, a rift, or maybe a twist of fate. The last thing he remembered was the blinding light that tore through his world and the sudden disorienting weightlessness that followed. Now, he was stranded in a world far beyond his understanding. All he knew for certain was that this wasn't Earth. Not by a long shot. He stumbled over an exposed root, cursing under his breath as he caught himself. His feet were sore, his legs weak from a long day of walking through the dense forest. He had hoped to find civilization, some sign of life, of hope, but what he found instead was a world that seemed to pulse with something ancient, something powerful. The trees here were massive, towering high above, their trunks thick enough to swallow an entire house. Strange vines draped from the branches like emerald waterfalls. The air hummed with a strange, melodic sound, and every so often, he swore he heard something moving just beyond the shadows. But it wasn't the forest that was the real threat. No, it was the feeling, the sickening realization that he wasn't alone. Something, or someone, was watching him. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a slow coil of fear tightening with every glance he cast over his shoulder. Suddenly, a rustling sound from the underbrush made him freeze. His breath caught in his throat as he crouched down, his hand instinctively reaching for the dagger strapped to his side. He had no idea what kind of creatures lurked here, but he didn't want to find out the hard way. From the shadows, a figure emerged, a giant. Not a human, not even close. This creature was a towering woman, easily 10 feet tall, her frame lithe but powerful. Her skin gleamed with an otherworldly sheen, the faintest blue tint rippling under the dim light that filtered through the canopy above. Long hair, braided and adorned with intricate beads, cascaded down her back like a waterfall of gold. Her eyes, sharp and silver, locked onto him with an intensity that sent a chill through his spine. She didn't move. Didn't speak. But there was an undeniable force in the air, the kind that made Nolan's body tremble in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was like thunder, rich and full of power, yet laced with something else, curiosity. And something else, too. Something he couldn't quite place. Nolan swallowed hard, his mouth dry. I'm lost." She didn't respond immediately, but her gaze never wavered from him. He could feel her studying him, assessing his every movement with the precision of a predator. The realization hit him then: he was the prey. She was the hunter. Lost? Her lips curled into a half-smile. "You've wandered into our lands. That makes you a trespasser." Nolan's throat tightened, but he refused to show weakness. "I don't mean any harm. I just need to find a way out of here." For a long moment, the giantess said nothing, her gaze never leaving him. He felt the weight of her stare, the way it dug into his skin like a brand. He should have been terrified. After all, here was a being far beyond anything he'd ever known, a creature who could likely crush him without breaking a sweat. And yet there was something about her, something both terrifying and mesmerizing. Finally she spoke again, her voice softer this time, though still thick with authority. "I am Talia. And you are a rare sight." Nolan frowned, his pulse quickening. "A rare sight? What do you mean?" Talia took a slow step forward, her boots thundering against the ground like a drumbeat. Nolan instinctively took a step back, the weight of her presence pressing down on him. "You are human," she said simply. "We do not often see your kind in these parts." He blinked, trying to make sense of her words. "You know about humans?" She nodded once. "We know enough." The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken words. Nolan could feel his heart racing, but he forced himself to focus. This was a moment of opportunity. He needed information, needed to understand what was going on here, before it was too late. Talia's gaze softened, but only slightly. You're far from your kind, little human. Why are you here? I don't know. I was somewhere else, and then I woke up here. His words faltered. He wasn't sure what kind of answer she was expecting, but he gave her the truth. She studied him for a moment, and then her lips curled into a knowing smile. The rift. It pulls those who are weak. Her words cut through him like a blade. Weak. He wasn't weak. He was far from it. But the way she said it, so effortlessly, made him feel smaller than he'd ever felt before. It wasn't a question of strength. It was a question of survival. Before he could react, there was a sound behind him, footsteps. Many of them. Nolan whipped around, his hand gripping the hilt of his dagger. The ground beneath him seemed to vibrate with each thundering step. And then, from the darkness, emerged more figures, more giantesses, just as towering, just as commanding. Talia's smile never faltered. It seems the tribe has taken an interest in you, human. Let us see what happens next. The sense of danger, of helplessness, sank deep into his bones. There was no escape now. The air was thick with the scent of fresh earth and damp leaves as Nolan stood among the towering figures of the giantesses. His heart raced, the beat echoing in his ears as Talia, the giantess who had first spoken to him, stepped forward with a deliberate grace that spoke volumes of her power. Her eyes never left him, sharp as a blade, weighing him as if he were a mere object to be appraised. Do not be afraid, she said, her voice soft but still carrying the weight of command. You will be treated well here, little human, if you understand your place. Nolan swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. The sight of the other giantesses, silent, watching, imposing, made the hairs on his neck stand on end. There was an energy in the air, an ancient pulse that seemed to hum in time with the rhythm of the forest. The giantesses moved like shadows, each one a sentinel, each one with the same calm, yet dangerous air. Talia's gaze lingered on him, her lips curling into a faint, inscrutable smile. The others are curious. But you are not the first human to appear here. Nolan's pulse quickened. What do you mean? There have been others like me? Not many, she replied cryptically, her voice almost a whisper. But they never last. His stomach tightened. He could see the unspoken warning in her eyes. Why? He asked, his voice rough. Why don't they last? Talia's smile faded, and for a brief moment, there was something cold in her gaze. Because those who are weak do not survive in our world. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Weak? Was that what he was, then? Stranded in this place with no way back, with nothing but his wits to survive? He refused to accept it. He wasn't weak. He had fought to stay alive this long. He wasn't about to let the fear of the unknown take him down now. Before he could respond, a sudden, powerful voice interrupted them. Talia, you bring the human to us? The voice came from behind him. He turned sharply to see another giantess approaching, her footsteps shaking the ground beneath him. She was even taller than Talia, with thick, muscular arms that rippled as she moved. Her skin was a deep shade of bronze, and her eyes, golden, fierce, locked onto him with an intensity that made him feel small in a way he hadn't before. Yes, Yara, Talia replied, her tone respectful but unwavering. He is here, as the rift has brought him. Yara's gaze flickered over Nolan, her expression unreadable. She stood just a few paces from him now, her presence overwhelming. He could feel the power radiating from her, almost as if she were a force of nature itself. She exuded strength, raw, untamed strength. It was impossible not to notice. Why is he here? Yara asked, her voice low and rumbling, like distant thunder. What does he want? I'm not here by choice, Nolan said, his voice sharper than he intended. He was tired of being treated as an outsider, a curiosity. I don't even know how I got here. Yara's lips twitched into a small, almost imperceptible smile. Another one of those who do not know their own power, then. Nolan bristled at her words. I know what I can do. I don't need your pity. Talia's eyes flicked to Yara, a silent exchange passing between them. Then, without warning, she reached out and grabbed Nolan by the arm, her fingers warm but strong as iron. You misunderstand, she said, her voice gentle but firm. It is not pity. It is recognition. You are here because you are meant to be. Nolan pulled his arm free, confusion clouding his thoughts. Meant to be? Meant to be what? I'm just trying to find a way out of here. Talia's smile returned, this time tinged with something almost affectionate. You are here because we need you. The rift does not open without reason. Nolan took a step back, the weight of her words sinking in. What are you talking about? What do you need from me? Before Talia could answer, the air around them seemed to grow colder, the forest falling into a deep silence. The other giantesses, until now standing at the edges, began to move closer, their heavy footfalls vibrating the earth beneath Nolan's feet. He could feel the collective weight of their gaze on him, the pressure mounting with each passing second. Yara's golden eyes never left him as she stepped forward, her presence even more commanding than before. You are not just a human, little one, she said, her voice low and dangerous. You are something more. Something special. Nolan's chest tightened, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. I don't know what you're talking about. Yara's lips parted, her smile growing predatory. You will. Soon enough. There was something unsettling in her tone, something that sent a ripple of fear through him. Whatever it was she saw in him, it wasn't something he could easily escape. The tension between them thickened, an almost palpable weight hanging in the air. He could feel the eyes of the other giantesses boring into him, studying him, calculating something he wasn't yet privy to. They were waiting for him to react, for him to make a decision, something he wasn't prepared for. Just as the silence became unbearable, a voice rang out from the distance. A shrill, excited cry echoed through the trees. Something is coming, one of the giantesses called. A challenge! The air buzzed with sudden energy, and before Nolan could ask what was happening, Talia's grip tightened around his arm. You are no longer a visitor here, human. You are one of us now, and it's time you proved your worth. As the giantesses moved into action, Nolan's mind raced. This was no longer about survival. It was about something far more dangerous, and far more enticing. Something that would change everything. And he had no choice but to face it head on. The ground trembled beneath Nolan's feet, and the air itself seemed to pulse with anticipation. The giantesses around him moved with purpose, their massive forms cutting through the dense forest with terrifying grace. He could feel the tension crackling in the atmosphere, and though his heart raced with fear, a strange sense of exhilaration followed close behind. There was no turning back now. He had been thrust into something far bigger than himself, and he had to either adapt or perish. Talia, her eyes glowing with an intensity that matched the pulsing energy around them, led the way. Her presence was magnetic, commanding, and Nolan found himself both repelled and drawn to her in equal measure. The other giantesses flanked him, their footsteps shaking the earth, as if they were preparing for something monumental. Yara was at Talia's side, her piercing golden eyes scanning the surroundings with a sharpness that made Nolan feel like prey. His instincts screamed at him to run, but there was no place to hide in this strange world, not when the very ground beneath his feet seemed to be alive with power. What's going on? Nolan finally asked, his voice shaky despite his attempts to steady it. Talia glanced at him over her shoulder, a knowing smile tugging at the corner of her lips. A challenge, human? It's time for you to prove your worth. Nolan's brow furrowed. Prove my worth? What does that even mean? The rift doesn't open for just anyone, Talia said, her voice low but firm. It opens for those who have potential, those who are meant for something greater. And now you must prove you're worthy of that potential. He swallowed, trying to process her words. This wasn't just some random accident. His arrival here, his presence, had purpose. But the weight of that realization was suffocating, and it left him grappling with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. They arrived at the heart of the forest, a massive clearing where the air felt charged with an electric hum. The trees surrounding it seemed to part for the Giantesses, as though recognizing their dominance over this land. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone circle, its surface engraved with ancient symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dimming light. Nolan's gaze swept over the area, and it didn't take long for him to understand that the stones weren't just a backdrop. They were part of something much more significant, a ritual, perhaps, or some sort of trial. As they entered the circle, the ground trembled once more, and a deep voice boomed from the edges of the clearing. It was guttural, ancient, and carried an authority that made Nolan's breath catch in his throat. "Who dares to challenge the tribe?" The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with expectation. The giantesses around Nolan stilled, their posture proud and unwavering. Yara, her golden eyes burning with intensity, stepped forward. "I do," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 storms. "I challenge him." Nolan's stomach flipped. Yara? She was going to fight him. Her power was palpable, and he knew she was a force to be reckoned with. But why? Why him? Talia's gaze flicked to Nolan, her expression unreadable. "Do you accept?" The question hung in the air, pressing down on him like an iron weight. He wasn't a fighter, not by choice, anyway. But something inside him stirred, an ember of defiance that refused to be snuffed out. This world, this strange place, had given him no answers, no mercy. If he was going to survive here, he had to fight. "I accept," Nolan said, the words coming out firmer than he expected. Talia's lips curved into a small, approving smile, and she stepped back, giving them space. Yara didn't move. She stood still, her eyes locked on Nolan with a dangerous intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "I hope you are prepared to face the true power of this world," Yara said softly, her voice a lethal whisper that carried the weight of a challenge. Nolan's heart hammered in his chest. What had he gotten himself into? He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for his place in a world that didn't understand weakness. The stakes had just become painfully clear. Without warning, Yara moved. The ground shook as she took a step toward him, the force of her stride enough to make Nolan stagger back. He instinctively reached for the dagger strapped to his side, though he knew it wouldn't be enough. She was far beyond his reach. She raised her hand, a massive, powerful appendage that seemed capable of crushing anything in its path. The air around her shimmered with the raw force of her energy, and Nolan could feel the heat radiating off of her, even from a distance. He had mere seconds before she closed the distance between them. Nolan's mind raced, his body instinctively tensing, but there was no room for hesitation. He ducked to the side just as Yara's hand swept past him with a terrifying swiftness. The air whistled as her hand narrowly missed him, the shockwave of her motion pushing him back with force. He stumbled, catching himself before he fell, and it was then that he saw it, the glint of something in the distance. A reflection. A weapon. A second later, he bolted toward it, his legs burning as he sprinted with everything he had. He needed to even the odds. But as his fingers brushed the cool steel of the sword, a sharp laugh echoed through the clearing. "Fleeing already, human?" Yara's voice rang out, cruel and mocking. He turned to face her, the sword now in his hand, his grip tight around its hilt. His heart pounded in his chest, and though his hands shook, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. And there was no turning back now. The clearing was deathly silent. The air, thick with tension, seemed to crackle like the moment before a storm. Nolan's grip on the sword tightened, the cold steel sending a chill through his palms. He was no longer just the scared human caught in the web of the giantess's world. With every breath, he could feel the surge of his resolve growing, propelling him towards something greater. But still, the weight of the situation bore down on him, and the growing pressure in his chest wasn't just fear anymore. It was something much more complex, more intimate. Across from him, Yara stood tall, unyielding, her golden eyes glowing with an intensity that could set the very air on fire. The gusts of wind that whipped around them seemed to bend to her will, her raw energy swirling like a tempest about to burst. She was formidable, a force of nature in her own right. And yet, beneath that intensity, there was something Nolan couldn't quite grasp. Was it anticipation? Or perhaps something deeper? The giantess spoke first, her voice low, almost a purr as she watched him, sizing him up. You're no longer a stranger to this world, Nolan. You've learned to fight back. To survive. Her words dripped with a strange mix of admiration and challenge. Nolan stood tall, keeping the sword raised, his eyes never leaving hers. I'm not done yet, he said, his voice thick with determination, though his heart pounded in his chest. Yara's lips curved into a smirk, but there was no humor in it. You think you're ready? To be one of us? To stand beside Talia, to be part of this tribe? Her words landed heavy, like a weight pressing against his ribs. The reality of what he was facing, the responsibility, the expectations, seemed to crash down on him all at once. The Giantesses were more than just colossal beings. They were a tribe bound by ancient laws, powerful and unyielding. And yet, here he was, standing at the precipice of that very world. You're stronger than I thought, Nolan. Yara continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. But strength is only part of it. Power is earned, not given. And you still have much to prove. Nolan's jaw clenched, a rush of adrenaline surging through him. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. Suddenly Yara moved. Her body was a blur, a shadow of deadly grace. In a heartbeat, she closed the distance between them, her movements impossibly fast for someone her size. Nolan barely had time to react before she struck, her massive hand aiming straight for him. The wind howled in its wake, and he felt the force of it like a wall of pressure. Instincts kicked in. Nolan dove to the side, rolling across the uneven ground, narrowly avoiding her hand as it crashed into the earth with a resounding thud. He scrambled to his feet, his heart racing, but before he could react, she was upon him again, faster this time. Yara's eyes locked with his, a glimmer of something, respect perhaps, flashing in them before the storm returned. You're not fast enough, human, she taunted, her voice a dangerous whisper. With a grunt, Nolan twisted his body, narrowly avoiding another strike, and lunged forward with the sword. It was a desperate move, but he had to try. Her eyes widened for the briefest moment. A fleeting sense of surprise, but it was quickly replaced by a sharp grin. She raised her hand just in time, catching the sword's blade effortlessly in her grasp. The metal bent under her strength, but it didn't break. She tossed the sword aside as though it were a toy. I told you, Yara said, her voice soft yet filled with power. You're not ready. Nolan's breath came in shallow gasps, but he refused to give in. He was bleeding from his side where her first strike had grazed him, but the pain was nothing compared to the fire burning within him. He could feel it, a quiet but unrelenting strength that had nothing to do with his physical body. It was the will to survive, to prove that he belonged. You're wrong, Nolan spat, rising to his feet, despite the searing pain. I'm more than ready. Talia's voice rang out across the clearing, commanding and unwavering. Enough. The tension in the air snapped. Yara's hand lowered, her posture stiffening, but the smirk never left her lips. Talia, you're making a mistake, she said, her voice a low growl. He's not ready. He'll never be. Talia, standing at the edge of the clearing, her eyes glowing with an intensity that matched the storm around them, met Yara's gaze with an implacable calm. He's ready. You've tested him. Now it's time for him to step into his own. Her voice was a quiet authority that left no room for argument. Nolan swallowed hard, his body aching, his vision blurred with pain and fatigue. But there was something else now, something within him that felt right. As though he had passed some invisible line. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a part of something greater, something that had been calling to him ever since he arrived in this world. He looked up at Talia, his voice hoarse but firm. What now? Talia's gaze softened slightly, and for the first time, Nolan saw something resembling respect in her eyes. Now you choose. Stay and fight for the tribe, or leave and return to a world that doesn't even remember your name. The air was thick with anticipation as Nolan stood at the crossroads. His chest ached with the weight of the choice before him. He could leave, escape the trials of this world, but that would mean walking away from everything. From Talia. From the Giantesses. From the very power that had drawn him in. But there was no hesitation this time. Nolan stepped forward, his body sore, his mind clear. "I'm staying," he said, his voice steady with finality. Talia nodded once, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Then welcome to the tribe, Nolan." But the battle was far from over. The world had just begun to show him what it truly meant to be part of it, and he wasn't sure he was ready for everything that was about to come.